Mihawk is one of the few characters in One Piece who doesn't really have a general consensus in regards to where they scale in the series, and this is mainly due to the fact that he doesn't actually have feats, and that a lot of his scaling is based on his portrayal and/or statements. This leads to people downplaying him to levels that directly contradict his portrayal, and despite the issues with that argument, I'm not going to say that you're wrong for thinking that. What I would say instead is that Mihawk not having feats makes a lot more sense and just further supports his portrayal, and that the way he's portrayed is the exact reason he doesn't actually need feats. First, I want to talk about the character of Mihawk and what type of person he is even prior to his introduction in the story. When we're first introduced to Mihawk, it's with him having the title of the world's strongest swordsman. At this point, he's already 41 years old. To put that into perspective, Whitebeard reached his prime at 38 years old. Mihawk has likely been a swordsman since he was a kid, just like Zoro. He's fought plenty of swordsmen, mastered all basic and most likely advanced forms of haki, including being the only person in centuries to create a black blade. The reason I say that Mihawk has likely mastered advanced forms of haki despite him not showing it is because eventually he's going to fight Zoro, and with Mihawk being Zoro's end goal, they will obviously have to be relative to each other, and Oda places a clear emphasis on haki and advanced forms of haki. If Mihawk was relative to Zoro, who has advanced forms of haki, while only using base forms of haki himself, it would genuinely make advanced haki kind of meaningless and a bit overrated if just basic levels of haki can contend with it. It's also worth mentioning that he's the one who taught Zoro haki to begin with. As for Conqueror's haki, when you consider that Zoro's kingly ambition is the same ambition Mihawk would have had prior to actually achieving his goal, Zoro having Conqueror's haki but Mihawk not having Conqueror's haki just wouldn't make any sense, as they have the same reason to actually have Conqueror's haki. So I say that to say that Mihawk's journey as a swordsman is essentially over. He's reached the pinnacle of what swordsmanship is. His title is one that is peerless. No swordsman is stronger than him, nor is there one that is equal to him. And this would include Shanks, which is even stated in One Piece Databook Red, where it states that Shanks once had the power to stand shoulder to shoulder with Mihawk, meaning that at one point he was equal to Mihawk but no longer is. Obviously there's two interpretations, one that Shanks has gotten stronger than Mihawk, or one in which he has gotten weaker than Mihawk. But if it were the case that Shanks is now stronger than Mihawk, then he would be known as the world's strongest swordsman, not Mihawk. And it wouldn't really make any sense, since even if he was stronger than Mihawk, he could just hold back or limit himself to a level that is equal to Mihawk, which would contradict the statement. Also, just based on how the statement is structured, it's far more likely that it's saying Shanks can no longer equal Mihawk because he is weaker. To further support this idea that Mihawk is stronger than Shanks, we know that he is waiting for an opponent who is stronger than Shanks, eventually being Zoro. I'm not going to get into the whole is Shanks a swordsman thing because it's very repetitive and just kind of dumb in my opinion, especially when in the same sentence where Mihawk is called the strongest swordsman, they call Shanks a swordsman, and it doesn't really get much more obvious than that. But that's just Shanks. This isn't a Shanks versus Mihawk video. The reason that Mihawk being stronger than Shanks is important is because Shanks is portrayed as an equal to Whitebeard on medicine, who's much stronger than even the Whitebeard in Marineford. And it's also stated several times that all of the Yonkos are relative, and that in a four-way battle it would be extremely hard for one of them to beat another. So Mihawk scaling over Shanks would also put him over all of the Yonkos, and by extension all of the admirals, as the admirals are relative to the Yonkos, if not some just being blatantly weaker than them. And this is all to say that Mihawk is truly peerless in the verse, which is even supported by his blade Yoru also being stated to be peerless and to be the strongest blade. Mind you, this is stated on the same page where it's stated that Kaido's blade can withstand all of his haki, and that Whitebeard's blade can withstand the full power of a prime Whitebeard. So despite the fact that some people will doubt it and just not believe it because it's Mihawk, Mihawk being stronger than people like Prime Garp, Prime Whitebeard, and even Roger is in no way far-fetched. To address some of the arguments used to downplay Mihawk, such as the fact that Jozu seemingly withstood Mihawk's attack, or the fact that Mihawk fought Vista. For the first point, people seem to forget a very important part of swordsmanship in One Piece, which is the ability to cut nothing, otherwise known as the breath of all things, in which the user only cuts what they intend to cut. We see this in Alabasta where Zoro swings his sword and it fails to cut leaves, but with that exact same swing he cuts a boulder. Does this mean that the leaves have better durability than the boulder? No. It's simply that Zoro intended to cut the boulder and not the leaves, which is the purpose of the breath of all things. So the fact that Mihawk's attack was intended to challenge or damage Whitebeard means nothing, because he didn't intend to cut Jozu. This is the case for any time that Mihawk has been blocked in Marineford as well. because his intention is to go after Luffy and these other people just get in the way. This is shown like pretty evidently when Daz Bones blocks Mihawk's attack, and then right after Mihawk literally one-shots him. The difference is that Mihawk in that instance actually intended to hit him, and in the first instance he intended to hit Luffy. As for Vista, there's not really much to say. Mihawk just isn't trying, and he's very casual, just swinging a sword around. And it's even stated specifically that Vista only matches Mihawk in terms of sword skill. And the reason that Mihawk says they should postpone is because Sengoku is going to trap all of the pirates in the bay, which is why Vista says that it would be advantageous for both of them. The last thing that I'm going to address is Mihawk measuring the power between him and Whitebeard and what it truly means to be the strongest. As we know, Mihawk is the strongest swordsman, and what comes with being the strongest is isolation. A series that pushes this idea several times is Jujutsu Kaisen, with Gojo and Sukuna being the strongest and being isolated from others, and how similarly, people are also the strongest of their time or their era, and they can relate to this feeling, such as Kashimo and Yorozu. When Sukuna talks to Kashimo and how they can relate in that aspect, and how Yorozu can also understand the feeling of isolation. Mihawk similarly feels this isolation and no one can relate to him. He quite literally lives alone in a castle. The theme of isolation is embedded in his character itself. And so Mihawk's interest in Whitebeard can be contributed to the fact that Whitebeard is also known as the strongest. However, when Mihawk goes to test this, rather than Whitebeard, Jozu jumps in blocking the attack. What this would tell Mihawk is that unlike himself who fights alone, as the strongest in isolation, Whitebeard has these allies who support him, which is why he can be seen as the strongest. This is further supported in both the Viver card and Ace novel, where in the Viver card it's stated that Whitebeard's title doesn't necessarily refer to power, but rather his way of life, and in the Ace novel where it's stated that in terms of physical power, Kaido is actually stronger than Whitebeard, and that Whitebeard is the strongest due to his way of living. Whitebeard is incapable of relating to Mihawk in this facet as they do not share the same type of isolation. So in this sense, Whitebeard isn't truly the strongest, which should be obvious because Whitebeard isn't peerless. Even in his prime, Roger was an equal to him, as well as Garp. And now in old age, he has 3 other characters being the Yonkos who are equal to him or relative to him. You cannot be the strongest and then still have peers, which is why in this sense, Mihawk is truly the strongest. So how can Whitebeard's title hold any merit in a power scaling sense when he has peers? Mihawk even says later on, after so many people jump in his way of fighting Luffy, that Luffy has the greatest powers on the seas, which is to gather allies, which just supports this narrative even further. One other thing I want to touch up on is the fact that Mihawk has the highest bounty of any non-Yonko character, which includes the admirals as well, who all have a 3 million bounty. Bounties usually aren't an inherent way to scale power, even though they do have a heavy play into it based off how they are structured within their crews. But it's different when you have somebody like Mihawk or the admirals, because these characters' bounty can only be attributed to their strength, as Mihawk doesn't really have any assets to his name as a pirate, and so even looking at the bounties, Mihawk would be stronger than any of the admirals. And even in comparison to the Yonkos, Mihawk has nearly as much as them, despite the fact that he has no crew, no assets, no poneglyphs, or any territory. Mihawk is also the only quote-unquote Yonko commander who has a higher bounty than the Yonko on their crew, and in fact, Buggy's status as a Yonko is mainly contributed to the fact that he has Mihawk under his crew. With that being said, I think it's extremely consistent that Mihawk is the strongest character in One Piece, in both current and old gen, as that's his entire character and his entire portrayal. And for that reason, he doesn't actually need feats. And it makes sense as to why he doesn't have feats, because he's bored, isolated, and waiting for somebody to surpass his greatest rival Shanks. Mihawk doesn't believe that anybody in the series can even give him a challenge currently. Of course, future characters and hypothetical characters like end of series Luffy or end of series Blackbeard or Zoro or Emu, etc. can surpass Mihawk, but as it stands now, Mihawk is the strongest, and I don't think you can prove that anybody is actually stronger than Mihawk without just directly contradicting the narrative and portrayal. But yeah, that's about it.